been able to sign on and see the presentation on the screen. We're going to go through today and discuss what is one of the more popular topics with the SEC and how firms are really overseeing and managing the risk around their vendors and third parties. Okay, great. Coming into up front. So your third parties. What we're going to look at is really, in starting at the high level, is what's the definition of a vendor and third party relationship. So it's basically anybody your firm is doing business with, any type of entity, where it's somebody that may have access to your data, access to your systems, or even a contract that's a business relationship where you're collaborating on selling services or marketing to the same clientele or collaborating in any way. They all should be reviewed and they should all be looked at. Now, not necessarily all with the same lens. Not all vendors are created equal, and that's where really an effective vendor risk management program has the best impact for an organization and how you go through that process. So, mentioned before, this is a category that the regulators are focusing on heavily, especially in the alternative investment space, where we know a lot of firms leverage third parties a lot, especially for their IT infrastructure. And in general, there's been a big migration the last couple of years and a continued path for firms to move infrastructure from within inside their walls to some type of cloud sharing service, or even having other collaborative services with other firms who they're doing business, whether it's on a private equity deal and sharing information through some type of data warehousing portal and exchanging documents. So that's one of the hot spots for the regulators. And I would say this is an area where in the last 6 months I've seen a few deficiency notices written to firms from the SEC in regards to how they are not managing your vendor risk management. And specifically what the deficiency notice was not having a defined vendor risk management policy. So a lot of firms will have within their written information security policy that talks at a high level how the firm goes about handling information security across many domains. They'll have a specific chapter or section regarding vendor and third-party risk management. A lot of the information security policies I've seen this section maybe 1 or 2 paragraphs or even a page. Honestly, it's not sufficient, and you really need to have a broader definition as to how you are risk rating your vendors, what that process is to determine if a vendor is high risk, medium risk, low risk, and then what you're doing in regards to each vendor. So all of this comes down to really having the firm being able to adopt a risk management process, which is outlined within a policy that goes through and specifies all the criteria that you'll look at in regards to a vendor. First spot for a firm to start is really having your vendor inventory. Some clients say, well, where do you start with that? Accounts payable is a good spot to see who you're paying money to. Usually how much you're paying is also one of the areas that will rank them towards the top. The people you're paying the most money to probably have some of the biggest integration points with your business and probably in that higher risk category. Other characteristics, of course, like I mentioned before, are access to your data, access to your systems. If you were part of our webinars that we had last fall, where we talked about that crown jewels discussion, your sensitive data, key systems, and business processes. So take the vendor risk lens and put it across your crown jewels and get an understanding of where they are touching your crown jewels is probably where you're going to have some excessive risk. And basically managing your vendors is an overall process, and it's a continual process. So once the vendor's onboarded, it doesn't stop there. What are you going to do on an ongoing basis? Depending on the amount of risk related to that vendor, there'll be more work. But looking at this circular effect here, you're going to start in the beginning and there's going to be a plan. And I'll go through it a little bit further in some of the other steps on the slides down the road, but what do you want to use this vendor for? Is it a business purpose? Is it satisfying a regulatory requirement? Is it a growth initiative? Is it an operational savings we're looking to do? Right? Is it a business development relationship where we're going to do marketing? What are all those aspects in regards to the plan? And then what's the due diligence? That'll come through some of that risk rating process that we'll talk about down the road. Contract negotiations. So I'll have a whole slide down later in the webinar that goes through specific points you want to look through on your vendors. And where this conversation has expanded over the last couple of years is specific topics around information security, around the protection of your data, ongoing monitoring. So there are many levels of ongoing monitoring. The one touch point could be we circle back to this vendor once a year and we go through our checklist of A through C. If it's a higher risk vendor, one that you have more dependencies on, maybe your IT provider or somebody that you're doing monetary exchanges with or an application developer, you may want to have some additional ongoing monitoring. There are even now tools and solutions in the marketplace that I'll talk a little bit more about later in the webinar that will allow you to rate a firm and get a security score, very much like a credit score. And this type of monitoring can be done 365 days a year. The vendor doesn't even have to know that you're conducting the monitoring, but it'll gather information being emitted into the World Wide Web from their network that'll generate a security score and send you alerts and an email update if that firm's security score should drop for potentially reason of a data breach or maybe a malware infection that has impacted their organization. So a lot of different tools and solutions, all of which the SEC and other regulators, the NYDFS, are familiar with and do now expect that firms will be able to do this level of monitoring. If the tools and solutions are available, they expect you're going to be using them or at least have evaluated them and made a risk-based decision on whether they're applicable for your organization or not. So we mentioned before, starting going through the circle that was around that triangle, is the planning. So starts out as what type of relationship is it going to be with this vendor? So are they going to have an integral play into our day-to-day operations? Are they going to be impacting our revenue generation? Is it going to be a new counterparty that we're going to use to help us dealing with restructuring or credit strategies in certain nation states that we've never dealt with before? You know, what are the legal and compliance aspects? Is it a territory that maybe there's some sanctions in place that the firm has to worry about? What are their specific inherent risks? So I think a lot of that comes down to is what type of data do they deal with? What territory are they in? What are the aspects in regards to the people, process, and technology that they have in place? And so what's the association and what's that business relationship going to be? How do they affect the strategic goals of our firm? If this is going to be something where we're going to look to leverage a third party for some enhanced data warehousing, that's going to help us be able to deploy capital in markets that we haven't ventured into before. Is this the right provider? So that'll come down into looking at some of the other areas you want to review in the planning part. What's the complexity of the arrangement? So if there's more complexity, that usually relates to more risk. What are the potential financial benefits? And do they outweigh the estimated costs? So a lot of times I flip this the other way is, what are the potential savings and do they outweigh the risk? So you may determine you want to use a smaller firm that is coming through with a price that is 20% lower than another provider. But if they cannot provide the resiliency that your firm is going to need from that provider, it just may not be worth the risk, right? You can't afford to have your email system having some disruptions, or if you're doing algorithmic trading, to have your data exchange lines have any interruptions. So even when picking your internet service provider, right? If it's a high-speed, high-frequency trading line that you need, you're going to look to get and spend more money for a secure T1 as opposed to using, some other less bandwidth or less sophisticated technology for them. So you also want to assess other items. We talk down below about assess the nature of the customer interaction, or in this case, with a lot of our clients, the investor interaction. So this may be in cases of your administrator. So how much activity is your administrator going to do on a day-to-day basis or on a month-to-month basis dealing with your customers? and the activities that they're going to be dealing with primarily would be around monetary transactions if it's an admin. So you want to get an understanding of what they're doing in regards to how they're training their people and the oversight that they are handing down and the level of sophistication that they have to be able to talk to your client, right? So you want to understand all the touch points that they're going to have. I would think everybody would say in that crown jewel discussion, you'd put your investors and absolutely the investor information. So how are they handling that out? Their information security implications, access to your systems. You want to look at things as to how are they going to access your systems, who's going to oversee access to the systems, if they determine they need access to your systems, if it's the IT provider that's going to have to connect in for maintenance. Do you open the portal and let them connect when it's convenient for them? Or is it going to be written in the contract and overseen that it's going to be a set cadence and protocol for when they're going to connect into the network? So these are all the specific things you want to evaluate in the planning. I mentioned before specific laws and regulations, especially when dealing with software as a service or certain things in application development. So it's evaluating a lot of these aspects. Now, when doing the planning, you're going to start up front and you may come to that first or second question around the risk and determine this is a low risk provider, and then you're going to be able to quickly move on to the next steps. But really getting that understanding of what's done up front. And so now talking about the next steps, we come into the due diligence and the selection of your vendor and going through this process. So when I mentioned earlier about having a sound vendor risk management policy, and once again, this should be a separate and dedicated policy because the complexity that it can go to will have some depth to it. And some of those areas that you'll look at is how you're going to evaluate the vendor. And one of the things you'll look at when evaluating them and determining what level of due diligence you're going to do is you want to risk rate the vendor. So part of risk rating the vendor is looking usually at least two categories. What's the business risk? And then also what's the product risk? So when you're looking at the business risk from an organization, you're looking at things in regards to how big are they, how large are they. So if my prime broker that I'm going to do my trades with is JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, business risk I think we could all say is pretty low there. If you're using Bloomberg as a trade terminal, business risk probably low there. If you decide that you're going to contract and use some smaller firm that's written their own application that says they're going to give you an edge on execution, it's going to have a higher level of business risk, right? There's less dollars and organizational structure behind that business. And then the same conversation comes into looking at the product risk. So is it a well-established product? Or is it something new that's being rolled out? Is it a beta version? How long has the product been in the marketplace? How many clients have used the product? Is this a new product? So those are the two types of categories that you'll go through and do the risk rating on your vendor. There'll be a series of questions you want to ask and basically drill down. Some of the other categories you may look at is what's their financial condition? So pull a Dun & Bradstreet report. Or if it's a firm that may not have those reports out there in one of the smaller shops, who's their equity backing? Right? Are they developing a product that they're going to have the ability to not only manage and support, but continue the growth and development in it? So experience and reputation, I think we mentioned on that before. The fees and the structure, their incentives to do business. Is there a conflict in the way that they're going to be incentivized to deliver services to your organization that may deter them from delivering the best possible service? Other things around fees and structures, is it too cheap? Are they going to be able to provide that service for that price? Are they over-promising and then going to be unable to deliver on what they've put forward? Qualifications, backgrounds, reputation of company and principles. I think what you look at in this category is, what is the vendor doing in regards to their employee due diligence? If it is somebody that is going to be connecting to my network, I'd like to at least get an understanding from that organization what they do during their onboarding process. I think a lot of this falls into the next two bullets of risk management and information security. You have to understand their program. So you have to ask, receive, evaluate their information security policies, procedures, and their overall information security program. And if you reach out to a firm and you ask now, it'll be certain things where they may provide you a due diligence questionnaire, and I get this all the time with firms where, what questionnaire do we put out in the marketplace, and get those responses back from the clients. I'd have to say the industry has yet to land on a standard. There are several floating out in the marketplace that I think many firms have grasped and utilized. What you should be getting from a vendor now, if they've gone through the process of answering a lot of firms' due diligence inquiries, you almost should not even have to send them a due diligence questionnaire, but they should have one already populated that is pretty close to what the industry standard is, or what 95% of the organizations are looking for, and be able to turn that around pretty quickly. If they can't, then that means they haven't been through the process enough times to have streamlined it internally. So I would consider their ability to be able to satisfy you with the questions in a quick and rapid time would be helpful. What a lot of the larger organizations, and where some of the standards are forming, is around a SOC 2 report, so a security attestation audit that comes in by a third party, and then they can serve this back to you and you can review that, very similar to an SSAE 16. Other type of attestation reports, but also getting an understanding of how they handle their information security program, how they report up to leadership, who's involved. So understanding what their level of security is very important. For the new regulation that kicks in next week on March 1st from the New York State Department of Financial Services, which is actually putting some pretty stringent requirements on those covered entities. They've also listed in that regulation that the expectations are your third parties will also adhere to some of the minimum cybersecurity requirements within that regulation. So the way that should translate to the firm that's bringing in a provider is if you are withheld to those requirements under NYDFS or even the SEC or NFA or other regulators for that matter, that your vendors and third parties should also be up at a minimum to those same standards. Okay, so that's other items. A couple other bullets down at the bottom. Insurance coverage. Do they have cyber insurance coverage? It's nice to know. Probably a little bit more of that financial backing. And then conflicting contractual agreements with other parties, especially related to the product and service that they may be providing you. A lot of times software firms will give you a contract that within says we may rely on other third parties to facilitate the delivery of our service. Now that may mean a cloud provider, or it could mean some other application development team that is working on the source code. So understanding the nesting of some of those relationships is going to be pretty critical. Once again, all around a risk rating review. And the higher risk, then the deeper you're going to have to look down. So coming into the slide I mentioned early on before, where we were talking about contract negotiations. So this is one of those things that's ongoing that you need to do on a regular basis for a few reasons. Scope may change with the client. Risks may change within your organization. The threats may change. And these are all the reasons why cyber policies are much more fluid and dynamic than a firm's traditional compliance manual, and also why having a separate vendor risk management policy would be important. But what you need to do is look through the contracts, not only upfront at the time of the onboarding, or I should say due diligence process with the client, but also ongoing. So understanding that the firm has stayed within the nature of the scope. A lot of vendors, especially in the IT space, cybersecurity more specifically, vendors are continually expanding their offering and trying to offer more services to the client, more touch points. And that's great if you can expand the relationship and it worked well for your organization. But make sure if there's those expansion of services that it's covered under those contractual agreements. Simple example maybe is, we weren't giving them online access to our databases to do support. We've learned 6 months into the agreement, it's much easier and saves a lot of time if we give them direct access. So was that covered in the contract? If you're going to change the handling procedures or the business processes that you're dealing with the vendor, before you make that change, let's review the contract and make sure it's there. And if not, then what are we going to do to go back and change the contract? Performance measures and benchmarks. There's a whole slew of categories that can fall under this area. You should look primarily around which ones are going to affect your service level requirements. If they're feeding you data, then it may be, efficiency and timing delivering there. If it's other things around research or trade information, you want to look at how they're measuring up against the contracts. Responsibility for providing, receiving, and retaining information. So who's responsible for the security of the data and providing a secure and safe mechanism to exchange back and forth? Some of this comes down even to regional regulatory differences. Australia, for one, puts it on the organization that's sending out the information. Some other territories may put it on, the receiving party. So having that understanding in the contract of who's going to own that responsibility and provide the secure mechanism. I mentioned earlier before compliance with applicable laws and regulations, costs and compensation, owners and licensing. A lot of this comes around software. If you are dealing with somebody that's doing custom application development with you, one of the things you look at is regarding the source code for that company. If they are bought or acquired, what happens to the company, right? What's transition plans? So getting an understanding of those items. And a lot of this here, we're not expecting the IT person to do this on their own. An effective vendor risk management program really takes efforts from multiple people within the organization, or if you need to leverage a third party. Absolutely, some of the areas where it needs to be looked into here has to be reviewed by somebody from the legal department, right? Where you're looking on some of the things on the technology and are they able to deliver, then your IT team may need to chime in. And if it's things tied into certain regulations in certain areas, that could be your compliance professional collaborating with legal teams. So it's really getting an understanding from different people within the business on what their input is on that vendor. Coming down to the halfway down the screen in red, data breach and cyber attack notification and incident response communication. So this is pretty popular in contracts written in the last couple of years, especially with those that have access to your data, is that have a contractual provision that if there is a breach of your data, what are the requirements for them to notify you? And then also, what are the requirements for them to keep you in the loop of communication on how they're remediating the efforts? Now, if you've done proper due diligence up front and have asked the firm in advance for a copy of their incident response plan, you not only will have that plan, but then if they're feeding you the communications through the process, you can get an understanding of if they're sticking to the plan. And so that's helpful to have. Business resumption, continuing plans, if they go down, what are they going to do to keep you up? Indemnification, definitely your legal teams want to get an understanding on that, on where the liability is going to lie. Defaults and termination. So when are you going to break the contract? What is going to be something that is going to give you the ability to get out? And then how are you going to get out is really going to come into one of the next conversations that you look at with the vendor. So moving from contracts to ongoing monitoring, you've done the onboarding, you've gone through the review, the vendor due diligence, and so once again we'll come down to a risk-based approach in determination of how much ongoing monitoring. If it's a vendor that's provided you a SOC 2 report, one of those security attestation reports I mentioned earlier, maybe you want to make sure to be doing an annual review. If firms did a SOC 2 in 2015, they're probably doing it again in 2016, 2017, and it becomes a regular process for them on an annual basis, and so you should be getting updates from those reports. But also reviewing, has their strategy changed? Have they had a reputational impact? Have they been sued? Are there other clients that have been dissatisfied with the work? Have they had any regulatory issues, right? Have they had any data breaches? What's their financial condition? You may need to go back again and do that Dun & Bradstreet report. I don't know if you're going to pull it on Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley, but maybe one of the smaller companies. So you want to get an understanding of what they are. You also look at the turnover of their people. So something like this from a monitoring perspective, if it's your IT provider, you may just get this vibe from dealing with them on a day-to-day basis and understanding, they've had some consistency with their staff, or have they had a high turnover in their staff. We've looked at some IT vendor reports, and we often see that if there is a high transition of staff, some of their other security score metrics may go down in some categories because they're just basically not keeping up with all the elements of, on-task requirements for patching certain things within the environment. Process for adjusting policies, procedures, controls, response to changing threats, very similar to the way you as an organization are expected to have your policies and procedures a little more fluid. What's their process? So what are they doing to detect the threats to their organization? What are they doing to understand what type of motives threat actors may have to come towards a administrator, right? Is it an email spoofing attack? Are they looking to compromise wire transfers? Are they looking to get information? There was a news story that came out at the end of 2016 around 3 traders that fell under the SEC suspicion for insider trading, but it turned out they actually hacked into law firms and got that information. So understanding what could be compromised as part of the vendor oversight process is pretty important. One of the things I think that you can look at when it comes to the ongoing monitoring of a vendor is what's going to be your process in place, what are going to be the tasks, and then what can you automate. And so if you can automate some of the workflows around how you're gathering information from the vendor, and then also, as I mentioned earlier, there are tools and solutions in the marketplace. We've used them here for several of our clients in conducting vendor reviews, where you are able to grab a score, a security score from a firm, and it's compiled basically from information that is publicly available, emitted out into the World Wide Web from their network, and they don't even know that you're capturing the information. So the information that's emitted from every IP address on the World Wide Web that's tied to a domain name will give information regarding if that firm has had a data breach, if they've had malware infections, botnet infections, some of their user activities, if their users are known to be go out and connecting to websites that are known to have malicious content, and even their general patching cadence. And so if they fall behind in one of these areas or have one of these elements up, it will diminish their security score. So you can get this type of solution for your very high-risk vendors that you could run that report on a daily basis, or actually have the firm run that report in the background. And if that score, and it's like a credit score a company would have, if that score drops, then you'd get an email alert. Very often in summertime, you'll see usually firm scores start to drop a little bit, primarily related to patching cadence. So it's vacation time in July and August, and staff tends to be a little more of a lighter crew than full-time, full support. And so some of those maintenance activities may diminish the firm's security score. So all types of tools and solutions that are out in the marketplace that are going to allow you to monitor the vendor. As always, mentioned many times in today's webinar, a risk-based approach. Your highest risk vendors are going to require more oversight, more due diligence, more layers of security. So layers are looking at reports. In some cases, one of those layers is going on site. So if they are a technology provider or hosting an application for you, it is very helpful to go on and understand their physical environment. Also reviewing things they've done in regards to their security program. So are they doing regular penetration testing? Are they doing vulnerability scans within the organization? And what are you doing to review those reports and get that information from them and see that they're doing this on a regular basis? And so as you're going through with your vendors, understanding more and more about how they are handling data, systems, connectivity is really what's going to help you get better insight, more comfort level. All of this view of going over your vendor, your third party, is expected by the regulators. There's been several cases noted in the regulatory notes recently. I think one that most people probably recognize is the end of 2015 from an investment advisor out in St. Louis that entrusted, or I should say stored, client information on a cloud provider and did not do their due diligence to review the cloud provider's information security policies and procedures. So they didn't assure that they were putting that data into a safe environment. The investment advisor got fined. And so that's what the regulators expect. You are the gatekeeper for that data. You are responsible for that client information, that sensitive information. You are responsible for evaluating the environment with which it's going to be stored and understanding, or at least doing to the best of your ability, everything you can to understand that it's being taken care of in a secure manner, and where there are some deficiencies, understanding the risk, and then taking some possible additional steps, whether monitoring or even limited use or activity around that vendor to minimize that threat. But the regulators expect that you have an understanding of all that relationship. So now let's just come into our final slide that we're going to talk about today, which is termination. So nobody really thinks of firing a vendor when you hire a vendor. But part of that planning process is understanding the dependencies that that vendor is going to have within your organization once that contract is signed. And then what would you be able to do if you had to break that relationship for whatever reason? It could be a simple dissatisfaction. It could be just a regular expiration. It could be a competing product that you've seen in the marketplace that is better. So whatever the reason is, you have to have an understanding of how you're going to unwind from this vendor. You know, what is going to be their responsibility to give you back some of your data if they have held the golden copy in certain cases of your information? What's going to be the timing for them to provide that back to you? If you're going to go change this vendor, is it a service that I'm going to have to run a parallel service for a period of time to transition off of that vendor? So these are part of the risk calculations that come up front when going through those contractual discussions and review with the vendor. Like I said, everybody likes to understand that, you know, or the belief that the relationship will be good, but understanding that it at some point in time will need to be considered and possibly terminated, and what are the impacts and how will you react and what action will need to be taken is probably more critical than bringing that vendor on in the first place. Because the longer you've had that relationship, the more you're entrenched with the business processes. So understanding not only how are you going to unjoin from the relationship, but also then how are they going to separate from your data, and also what are they going to do with your data in regards to not only returning it, but destructing copies that they have on site there. Do they have a regulatory requirement to hold it for a period of time? Is there a contractual clause in the agreement that allows them to keep a copy just to safeguard in case of some legal actions? And what is the period of time that they would keep that copy? So the more your data is spread out, the more hands your data is in, the more liability you have. So you have to have an understanding of that liability, and then if that termination happens with that vendor, how do you narrow the liability? How do you rein things back in? So a lot of topics to go through in a very short period of time today, but we do know that vendor risk management is one of the areas we've heard a lot from our clients. It's one that we have absolutely seen the regulators come in and focus on with organizations. Definitely one we've seen where there's been deficiency letters issued for firms not having a separate vendor risk management policy. And then ultimately what you have to have in place that's going to help you as an organization manage a lot of this is a way to track certain activities that you're doing around your vendor review. Spreadsheets are helpful, but there is also going to be supporting documents and supporting information that you're going to need to track. So whether that's stored in some type of SharePoint system or some type of tracking tool, some type of compliance management solution, a governance risk compliance tool is definitely helpful, not only for your own sake in regards to being able to monitor that vendor, track all the activity that you've done in the past, right? So if somebody's done a vendor review and has managed that program for the firm for 3 years and they leave the organization, what was left behind that's going to allow somebody else to step into that same role and be able to continue the process and not miss a beat? If the regulator comes in, how easy is it going to be for you to show them what you've done in regards to your vendor as opposed to explain to them? So the more you can show and display in some type of tracking tool or solution or GRC type solution will be much more beneficial, because likelihood is your vendor dependency will increase. As I mentioned up front, it's a big trend now for infrastructure to be outsourced, and a lot of data warehousing and a lot of software as a service solution. A couple other points I'm going to add in here at the tail end also. When you're using third parties, also have an understanding of what employees in your organization have access to the third parties. So one of the things you look at in regards to your third-party relationships is who in your organization handles that relationship, who manages that relationship. If we're paying for a Bloomberg service or an Intralink service or some other portal type solution that our employees are allowed to log into for certain data services, what's the oversight of our employees logging in there and how are we managing that access? If the employee leaves the firm, how are we making sure that that's part of our offboarding process for that employee to remove the access? So you wouldn't want your employee, that ex-employee, to still have access and be able to go in. So all types of things, and as I mentioned up front, this is why a separate and much more comprehensive vendor risk management policy is needed than just a few paragraphs or a page in your larger policy. So that's going to come to the conclusion of today's webinar. We appreciate everybody joining in, as always, for the Accordion webinars. We hope you've provided some valuable information. You'll see up on the screen here as well that you can visit our Accordion website at accordion.com. You can see some of our tools and solutions. And actually, I'm being told we're just going to check for a couple of quick questions that may have come in across the line. So before we depart, we're going to just check. I know Nicole, who works here with us, said questions have come in. And
Mike, we actually had a few questions asking if the presentation will be available after this webinar. The answer to that is yes. An electronic copy of the slides as well as a recording of this webinar will be available on the Accordion website under the webinar section. So feel free to check there to review this webinar, both the slides as well as the recording.
Excellent. Any other questions?
Yes, we have another question that just came in. Can you give the specifics of the advisors who got fined so they can review the notice?
So the one I was mentioning specifically in September of 2015 is R.T. Jones, and that notice is posted on sec.gov, so it is on the SEC website. There was another report late last year, I think it's still being contested by, I believe it was Lincoln Financial, that had a similar lack of vendor oversight, and that was a six-figure fine. The one R.T. Jones was $10,000 out of, it was $75,000. It was up to 10,000 individuals' personal information that was compromised. The one for Lincoln Financial was over $600,000, and it was a little more significant. And then for some specifics, unfortunately, I cannot reveal the clients that we have that were cited for deficiency for policies, but they are, it's an area that the SEC knows firms lever heavily on, and what they're really looking for as well is that leadership understands these vendor relationships. So as mentioned in our previous cybersecurity webinars, It's an organizational-wide approach. Leadership has to set the tone from the top. Leadership has to understand the risks. So leadership really has to have some input or at least some knowledge of that vendor relationship being threaded up to them from a risk perspective, right? So the ones that are having the highest risk definitely need to have more attention. Any other questions, Nicole?
I have not seen any others come in.
Okay. Well, great. As I was mentioning before, you can go and see a list of all our services on our Accordion website. We also have up there a demo for our Accordion pilot software, which a lot of our clients have been using for task management and also managing some of those vendor risk workflows. If you'd like to reach out to me directly for any questions, my email address is mcorcione, M-C-O-R-C-I-O-N-E, @cordium.com. Be glad to schedule any conversations and answer any questions offline. So once again, I thank you for joining our webinar today. Please keep an eye out for emails for future webinars. We do expect to have a few more coming up in the month of March. Thank you and have a great day.